Hello, I'm Floyd Stokes, your instructor for AJ2, Introduction to Law Enforcement at College of the Redwoods. Today I want to discuss Chapter 1 of our text. The text is titled Policing. Chapter 1 deals with the origins and evolution of American policing. This chapter's objectives are threefold: to outline the origins of policing, to summarize the various eras of policing, and to outline the emergence of state and federal law enforcement agencies. To begin, perceptions of police are often markedly different than reality. These perceptions are often skewed by what people view on TV or the internet, or read in the newspapers and magazines. And the police are under intense scrutiny these days by both the media and the public. For students of policing, an appreciation of history is essential in order to understand the contemporary structure of law enforcement in the United States today. Most countries today rely on one or only a few agencies for law enforcement. However, in the United States, there are thousands of agencies with hundreds of thousands of employees. No other country has the policing system that looks quite like ours. And history often repeats itself. We should learn from our past mistakes and not repeat them, if possible. One of the earliest known methods of policing was kin policing, which involved families, clans, and tribes enforcing informal rules. Individuals who deviated from community norms were often dealt with harshly. This method of policing changed during the rise of the Greek city-states and the Roman Empire, and law enforcement evolved from what was essentially a private affair to a public one. Greece and Rome began to use appointed but unpaid magistrates to enforce the law until about the 3rd century BCE in Rome and the 6th century in Greece. The first paid law enforcement official was the praefectus urbi, a position created in Rome at about 27 BCE. These were individuals who patrolled the streets day and night. After the Roman Empire fell, law enforcement became the responsibility of the individual monarchies throughout Europe. Kings used military forces for law enforcement, but they also relied on the so-called night watches, or groups of citizens who roamed the streets looking for signs of trouble. Members of the Night Watch were given the authority to investigate crimes and make arrests. The Night Watch system eventually evolved into the Frank Pledge system, which became more formalized around the 12th century when kings appointed individuals known as chief pledges to ensure that the system worked. In the Frank Pledge system, 10 households were grouped into a tithing, and each adult male member was held responsible for the conduct of the others. 10 tithings were known as a hundred, or parish, and a group of several parishes eventually came to be known as a shire. Shires resembled modern-day counties in terms of their size. The term sheriff, as a matter of fact, came from the Old English term shire reeve, which means keeper of the shire. The shire reeve was granted authority by the Norman kings to levy fines against criminals and also to levy fines against the parishes for failing to capture criminals. In England in 1285, constables were appointed to inspect the arms of the parish and to assist the shire reeve with law enforcement. Men over the age of 15 formed the posse comitatus, which assisted with the pursuit and capture of dangerous criminals. Magistrates, who eventually became known as justices of the peace, began to be appointed by the king or the sheriff around the 13th century. They had primary responsibility for adjudicating crimes, not unlike modern-day judges. In England, from which we derive many of our traditions, this was the predominant model of law enforcement until the 19th century. What set early approaches to policing apart from modern policing practices is that most paid officials charged with enforcing laws were volunteers. If paid, they were not salaried as police officers are today. Then, in 1735, things began to change. 2 parishes were given authority to pay their watchmen out of tax collections. And toward the middle of the 18th century, John and Henry Fielding, 2 Bow Street magistrates in London, started to pay men to serve as constables and to patrol the streets at night. These Bow Street runners, or thief-takers as they were called, patrolled the city on foot and the surrounding areas on horseback. They also performed investigations, and for that reason have been described as the first known detective unit. In 1800, the Thames River Police were paid by public moneys. Private police forces did not disappear, however. Outside London, in more rural areas, much of law enforcement was still the responsibility of churches, communities, parishes, magistrates, and a variety of other individuals. Moving beyond England, other countries, including France, Prussia, Russia, China, and India, all began to make the shift from private to publicly funded law enforcement. The influence of the English model. To a large extent, policing in London became the model for policing in America. In 1822, British Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel criticized the state of policing in London. Some years later, he was responsible for passage of the Metropolitan Police Act, which was adopted by Parliament in 1829. This legislation created the world's first large-scale organized police force in the City of London. 2 men, Charles Rowan and Richard Mayne, were appointed to oversee development of the force. They adopted a military organizational model, and their officers, known as Peel's Bobbies, wore uniforms, which was opposed by citizens at first, but which eventually gained widespread acceptance because they went to great lengths to ensure their officers behaved properly, and they embraced the concept of crime prevention as well as response. Peel's 9 principles of policing, which are shown on this slide and listed on page 4 of the text, are as valid today as they were in 1829. Policing comes to America. The first North American colonists settled along the eastern seaboard. They hailed from a number of countries, of course, including England. Early on, churches in America were heavily involved in crime control, though without a formal criminal justice system. Stocks, floggings in public squares, and even public hangings were common methods of dealing with wayward individuals. Public punishments, often witnessed by hundreds of people, made clear to everyone the consequences of inappropriate behavior. As more colonists moved to the New World, however, they brought knowledge of English criminal codes, law enforcement agencies, and methods of punishment, and they adapted them to serve the needs of their new communities. As America came of age, more immigrants arrived and settled in urban areas. Cities became increasingly crowded, dangerous, and dirty. Unemployment levels were high, living conditions were terrible, and sickness abounded. By the mid-1800s, crime had become commonplace throughout many American cities. People stole and looted to survive. Organized gangs formed, fought for territory, and contributed to the violence and mayhem within the cities. Early efforts to control crime fell on the shoulders of appointed constables and citizen volunteers. The constables patrolled during the daytime, citizens patrolled at night. But as the cities grew more and more dangerous, this system could not keep pace with crime. In 1844, the first Metropolitan Police Department, consisting of only 16 officers, was formed in the New York City area. The force was reorganized and expanded to 800 officers in 1845. Then, 12 years later, in 1857, the New York Police Department was officially formed from the 18 separate police forces that patrolled within the area that comprises present-day New York City. There were two differences between London's police and America's large city police forces. First, American police were heavily involved in politics, answering to political leaders or ward bosses. Second, American police officers were more willing to use force. These two unique features of American policing contributed in no small part to policing as it is known today. The move west. As immigrants moved westward across America into frontier territory, lawlessness was abundant. In fact, the frontier mentality of fending for oneself and providing for one's own self-protection fueled plenty of violence. Disputes were typically settled with public violence, and law enforcement was either unreliable or non-existent. Sheriffs and their deputies were appointed by town leaders to provide some semblance of law enforcement, but their authority was not always welcomed or respected. Frontier communities often formed their own posses and vigilante citizens groups. You've all seen the movies on TV showing and highlighting the plight of Old West law enforcement, I'm sure. Stephen F. Austin formed a group of tough fighters in the early 1800s to protect settlers moving into what later became Texas, and of course that group later became known as the Texas Rangers. Unlike the evolution of policing in other nations, Americans rejected centralized power and shunned any national police force. Law enforcement became a local effort that reflected local priorities and issues. That is why today we see thousands of distinct police agencies at various levels of government all across the United States. The downside to this is that during the early years, unqualified officers, little accountability, political influence, and corruption were commonplace, especially in the cities. And unique circumstances existed in the American South during the 18th century until the end of the Civil War. There, slave patrols, which were formed to apprehend and control slaves, represented a crude form of policing. Policing eras. Most researchers agree that changes to policing in America occurred in three distinct eras. The political era, from the 1840s to 1930, came about because of a need for social order and security in a dynamic and rapidly changing society, but the police were largely controlled by politicians and owed their jobs to them. The Reform era, from 1930 to the 1970s, came about because citizens called for reform and the removal of politics from policing. During this era, a crackdown on organized crime occurred, and police gained pride in their profession, focusing on traditional crime fighting and the capture of criminals. Also during this period, the automobile and radio communications played an increasingly important role in law enforcement. The community era, from the 1970s to 2001, came about because of a realization that effective community partnerships can help prevent and solve crimes. During this period, police focused on quality of life offenses and worked to identify and serve the needs of their communities. During the reform and community eras, certain individuals stood out as innovators and leaders. For example, during the Reform era, August Vollmer, the first police chief of Berkeley, California, was the recognized leader of America's police reform movement. During the Community era, O.W. Wilson, the Wichita, Kansas police chief in the 1930s, epitomized a new way of thinking that stressed service and almost a customer-friendly element to police work. The Community era strongly influences contemporary law enforcement today. Now everything has changed again. The new era, which some experts referred to as the counterterrorism era, came about in 2001 after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Towers in New York City and ongoing threats to the safety and security of Americans. Now the emphasis is on law enforcement at all levels, building a partnership with the community to gather intelligence and combat terrorism, domestic and international. Beyond local law enforcement, state agencies such as the Texas Rangers and the Pennsylvania State Police came into existence for different reasons. The Texas Rangers initially to protect settlers, and the Pennsylvania State Police to maintain order in the western Pennsylvania mining region. But both of these agencies, like other state agencies, gradually assumed greater law enforcement responsibilities and adopted professional standards. We will look at state agencies in more detail in Chapter 3. Early federal agencies included the U.S. Marshals, of which 13 were appointed by President George Washington in 1789 in accordance with the Judiciary Act. The U.S. Marshals focused their efforts on apprehending counterfeiters until the Secret Service was formed. They also were required to take the national census every 10 years, and they did everything from arrest fugitive slaves to confiscate property used to support the Confederacy. During the latter part of the 19th century, the marshals and their deputies were responsible for maintaining law and order in the Old West. U.S. postal inspectors, whose existence actually predated the War of Independence, targeted crimes committed via the mail. The U.S. Secret Service, which was established in 1865 with the mission to suppress counterfeiting, today has other responsibilities as well, including the protection of the President and others. The Bureau of Investigation, now known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, was formed in 1908 to investigate antitrust land fraud and similar matters. The agency grew rapidly and became the primary investigative agency for federal crimes. It ascended to a position of high visibility during the 1920s when J. Edgar Hoover was appointed to lead the agency. Hoover was a controversial but effective leader through his insistence on a crime-fighting role for FBI agents. We will discuss the FBI in greater detail in Chapter 3. Well, to summarize this chapter, policing in America has its roots in the English system. American policing has evolved through three distinct eras: political, reform, and community eras, and we are on the cusp of a fourth era, the Homeland Security era. State and federal law enforcement agencies have their own unique histories. Before I close, be sure to read page 13 of the text that discusses the case, the Minuteman Project and Border Security. Well, that's it for now. We'll see you in class.